2 weeks ago, I talked about the Peter Principle with Dr. Nanette Miner. She's a leadership training and a succession planning expert. And we talked about the need to start changing our perspective and look at leadership as a profession and stop looking at it as a promotion. In the past, I talked a lot about the consequences of our obsession with leadership. And today, we're going to talk about one of those consequences, the consequences to the employees. That's going to be our focus today. I have a guest today. My guest is Dr. April Minatrea. I thought I'm going to have a hard time reading her last name. Apparently, I can't even say the word apparently. Apparently, I can't say April. Uh, April Minatrea is a clinical psychologist. She focuses on the leadership industry, having done work with military and combat veterans, many years in private practice, now taking the lessons that she learned from people who were injured in battle and apply them to people who are injured in the workplace, not physically injured by typically bad leadership. She defined the term critical leadership injury, CLI, a lasting negative effect of interaction with a leader or authority or in one's role as such. This should be interesting. So let's start right after this. Welcome to the Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? April, welcome to the Trust Show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And as you noticed, I am very good at saying your name, especially your first name, April. I can't say April anymore. So let's dive right into it. What are the consequences to employees from bad leadership? What is leadership injuries?
I think there can be multiple ones. And it happens to the individual, and then it ends up impacting teams and organizations, right? It ends up impacting the entire culture. But for the individual, it can be something where they take something personally, and it alters their beliefs. It might be their belief about themselves, how they see themselves, their sense of self-esteem or their confidence and their ability to show up again. It might be altering their beliefs about how they see leadership or authority in general, how they see the organization, right? Marcus Buckingham says people don't leave companies, they leave managers, right? But if you have that manager that does that damage, then they might actually be looking for another job, right? And so there's these multiple effects that it can have. And yet the tricky thing is some of those things are subtle. Some of those things actually become subconscious. And they become blind spots where people don't even recognize, oh, that thing that happened to me 10 years ago actually altered my worldview, either my view of myself, my view of working for someone or with someone or whatever that is. And that ends up impacting how they show up in future job situations or how they don't show up in future situations. And then I think ultimately in terms of kind of our area of interest today is it impacts the ability to trust moving forward.
So, you already know my 8th law of trust. The trust is a two-person game. The level of trust that one person has, let's say the employee has in a leader, is not just the product. It's not only dependent on the leader's trustworthiness, but actually it's the product of the leader's trustworthiness and the employee himself or herself's trustfulness, their willingness to trust people. So I think what you're saying here is that trustfulness of employees in leaders gets hurt.
It does. And here's the tricky thing, that effect can carry forward. So leader A was the one who did the damage. They said something, they did something, they didn't do something, whatever it was, right? And that person, maybe they even leave that job, but now their trustfulness has been impaired. Leader B is a great leader, but they're dealing with an injured player on their team. And now I think a lot of leaders are like, man, I'm having to clean up a mess I didn't make. I'm having to fix something I didn't break. And so those trustfulness impairments can carry forward if they're not addressed and resolved.
So, in your experience, is this all it takes is one bad leader for somebody to be impacted or injured, to use your terminology, injured for life? Does it take only one leader, and does it take one day, or how long? How long of a? I mean, I know, like for example, with hearing loss, it's not that one loud
Mhm.
sound; it's a lot of loud sounds over a long period of time. Does it take a long time, or can it happen just like that?
It depends. It can be something that's a one time thing that, and especially if it's like, hey, this one time thing impacted a belief, it got lodged right in there, and I kept operating on that belief, and then I had a confirmation bias, so I kept drawing things into my world that created these self-fulfilling prophecies. It can happen that way. Sometimes it is a chronic situation and it's not a single event, so you can have the interaction of both, and then there's also a kind of level of severity, right? There are certain things, if your boss said, man, those shoes don't match, or something, and you felt embarrassed or something like that. Well, that's not necessarily going to tank your career forever, right? That's probably an easier one to just kind of, okay, rub some dirt on it. Let's get back in the game, right? And yet some of it also depends on where we are in our development. How, are there other places where we already have insecurity? I remember talking with somebody, and they had a teacher who said something to them when they were 9 years old, and 20 years later they were still living in that because they were so young and so impressionable. And so this idea that, oh, I'm not going to speak up in front of authority, got stuck in there because they were really young, right? So it kind of depends on a lot of different factors. It is possible for it to be a one-time thing and to carry forward. It doesn't have to be that way. And then the other thing that you said, man, is this mean I'm going to be damaged for life? And the answer there is no. You may experience the effects of it if you never address it. However, one of the things that we see even with post traumatic stress, right? That's kind of the world that I came from. If those things are never addressed, yeah, they can fester for years and years and years, and people can go their whole lives without ever getting better. However, just like there's post traumatic stress, there's post traumatic growth. And when people shine a light on these things, they begin to unpack them and say, hey, what really happened here? Okay, I altered my beliefs. Is that really true? The new belief that I've adopted, how do I want to deal with this going forward? People can get better and people can become stronger if they'll do the work to take a look at these things and say, wow, how do I actually redeem my story? I don't have to live as a victim for the rest of my life. I can actually find victory over this.
Let's not go there yet on how do we get out of it. But I was thinking only two components, two elements. One is how deep, and the second is how long. So how deep was the betrayal of trust, if you will, by the
Mm-hmm.
leader? But it doesn't have to be deep and short. It can be somewhat shallow, but for a very long period of time. But you brought in something else, and that is, it's one thing to say, I lost my trustfulness in leaders as such, but and maybe I didn't understand it. Did you say that it can also affect my own trustfulness in myself, the trust that I have in myself?
Yes. Yes.
Ooh.
It can impact my confidence, right? And I think this even is broader than when our trust is broken. Maybe it's by a leader. It could be other situations. That idea of trustfulness, I think a lot of our ability to trust hinges on, do I have what it takes to correctly evaluate? Am I a good judge of character? Do I have the ability to tell who's trustworthy and who's not? And if I've gotten burned, then my confidence and my ability to accurately assess that has been compromised. And so until I build that back, my trustfulness is probably going to be hampered.
Okay. What are the consequences? So, I lost trust in my leader. What are the consequences, personally to me, but also to the company, from me being hurt like that?
I think one of the biggest we're seeing right now is the quiet quitting, right? Hey, if you don't have my back, I'm out. I'll stay. I'll collect a paycheck. I'll punch the clock, but I'm not really in it, right? if I don't trust my leader, if I don't respect them, then I'm probably not going to give them my best, right? And I'm not going to continue to invest myself in what they're asking me to do if that trust has been compromised. So you get people who are just kind of coasting instead of being all in. And
Yeah.
then multiply that times however many employees. Multiply, okay, so we have somebody now who's an injured player, so they're not at full strength. What happens to the rest of the team? They've got to pick up the slack for the person who's like, I'm not really in it. And then if that bad morale and the the water cooler chatter or whatever is about how bad the leader is, then that's spreading, right? So now that's affecting the culture. By the way, going to one of the things that you talk about in terms of people's trustworthiness being impacted by how much trust is given to them. So if the leaders kind of now got a bad rap and bad, rumors are spreading and all of that kind of stuff, then if the leader doesn't feel trusted, how trustworthy are they going to behave, right? And so this problem can kind of snowball on itself pretty quickly if you don't nip it in the bud.
Wow, you read the book of trust. I can tell you that you just touched on the reciprocity of trust. But Gallup earlier this year published a survey. This is kind of, by the way, how you can play with numbers. The statement that came out with that survey was that the level of employee engagement has increased since 2019. And you're like, wow, employee engagement has increased. And then if you go into their numbers, you find that it went from 20% all the way to 23%. And then, yes, there are the 18-19% of employees who say that they are actively quitting. So they just tell everybody, I'm out of here. I'm just finding another job. But there's the 59%. It's a huge number. 59% are what you described. Those are the quiet quitters. Those are the people who they have retired. They just didn't tell anybody. They still show up at work.
Yes.
I found in my own research, and again, research done by others, that productivity goes down, creativity goes down, everything goes down. But those are the consequences to the company. So we have employees that are not productive, not effective, not creative.
Mm-hmm.
They know they're not. They don't care because right now they are injured.
Yes.
Is there long-term damage to those employees?
I think there can be, because I think there's also something in terms of our own mental health and then eventually our physical health, right? If you're waking up every day and you don't have a sense of drive and purpose and something meaningful, and you're having to just kind of trudge to the mines and, slave away to get the paycheck, there's something that does in terms of stealing your joy and stealing your hope, and the sense of meaning that you have about your life can be severely compromised. And then that eventually, that kind of stress can negatively impact your health. And then if you're showing up in a work environment where you don't trust your leader, you feel like you kind of have to be watching your back, and you're just kind of like, hey, I'm trying to just kind of stay off the radar and all of that. And then whatever those team dynamics have become, those kind of toxic environments psychologically also eventually impact our health. We don't thrive in those kinds of environments.
I realize that you and I probably know that, but we didn't talk about it. What are the type of injuries? So what are the things that the leader does to an employee that causes them to be injured or to lose trust in the leader? What are the type of actions the leaders do?
I would say they kind of fall into two broad categories. One is the presence of something bad. And so, probably the most egregious kind of thing might be somebody who makes, who dresses somebody down, especially if it's in front of a group or something, right? This angry outburst and yelling. Sometimes it's just a little comment. Sometimes it's the chronic criticism. Sometimes it's the micromanaging. That is, I'm going to tell you what to do, and I'm going to tell you what to do, and I'm going to tell you what to do, which is communicating, I don't trust you, right? I don't believe in you. And so there's a disrespect there that can be injuring. Sometimes it's the absence of something good. So somebody is working really, really hard, but they're not being recognized, right? Somebody who gets passed over for a promotion. That's one of the ones that really, I think, cuts at people when they're like, man, I was qualified. I had done everything to get this. And then they gave it to somebody else because of a relation. They gave it to their friend instead of the person who does it, right? So things like that, where it's something that needed to be present, or being hung out to dry, like, hey, we've given you this responsibility, but we're not giving you the resources to actually doing that. We're setting you up for failure. And in sometimes even setting you up to be a scapegoat, because we didn't want that to succeed. We actually wanted to kill that initiative. And so you're going to be the one that's going to take the fall for all of us, right? Things like that, where it's like the absence of something that should have been present can also cause those types of injuries and compromise trust in leadership.
You talked about micromanagement. Professor Teresa Amabile from Harvard Business School, she had a great definition to autonomy, which is the opposite of micromanagement. She said that with autonomy, you don't tell the employees how to do their job, but you shouldn't let them decide which job to do. So, and her analogy is actually a mountain. You need not tell the employee how to climb the mountain, but you don't let them decide which mountain to climb. So you still need to tell them which mountain to climb and not let them roam free, do whatever you want. But you need to not tell them how to climb that mountain. But in my own research, part of it was quantitative, and what I found was a 49.4% correlation between autonomy and creativity and productivity. So the higher the autonomy, the lower the higher the productivity and creativity. But I want to bring up something else. There was a study done in London. I don't remember which university in London quite some time ago, but they asked people about their need for autonomy and do they believe that autonomy is important to them. And it wasn't 100%. It wasn't 100% of people who said autonomy, I care about autonomy. It was 72%, I believe, that said I care about autonomy, which leads you to think that 28% said I don't. I remember personally, you talking about micromanagers. I think that there was a period of time when under the word micromanager, there was a picture of me. And I had two employees working for me, and I was micromanaging them left and right. I told them exactly what to do. And at some point, I got so busy with other things that I just told them, you know what, you're going to have to finish this project by yourselves. And they did, and they were successful eventually. And then I interviewed them because to me, that was weird. How can you do it all by yourself without me telling you what to do every step of the way? So I talked to one of them, and they're both very smart. I talked to one of them, and he said, the moment you said, this is our project and you're not going to get in the middle of it, he said, I felt like sky's the limit. I mean, he was elated, to say the least. The other one, and I was very fortunate to have interviewed them separately because I needed to understand why did they experience that. The other one, he said, and these are his words, you dropped a hot potato in our lap and let us do it instead of you leading us to how to do it. So I think it kind of comes down to my third law of trust, which is trust is personal. Not to every two people would react the same thing to the same thing that the leader does. How is the leader supposed to know if what they do helps the employee or injures the employee?
I think communication is really key there. And exactly what you did, you sat down with them and you realized, oh, for one person, this leadership style feels great. For the other person, oh, they're wanting a little bit more hands-on, for that person, direction was how you expressed that you cared about them, right? You were equipping them with very specific things. For the other person, giving them responsibility and putting your trust in them and saying, I believe in you and I believe you've got what it takes to figure that out. That's what made them feel valued and cared about. So having those conversations and checking in and saying, how does this feel to you? Is this something that is working for you? Do you need more autonomy? Do you want more direction? And letting people give you that feedback and then adjust accordingly. and
You
recognize
know,
that it may
you
change over time.
yeah, you said something about the leader dressing down an employee. So when a leader says, an employee comes to the leader and has an idea, and the leader says, "This is the stupidest idea I've ever heard." Is that a bad leader?
That is, well, it doesn't necessarily make us think it's a good leader. It doesn't make me feel like that's somebody I want to work for. I'll say that. I'll say that.
Okay.
It and
Okay.
it and
So
it's a high potential for injury leader. Let's put it that way.
okay, I'm glad you didn't dig yourself into a hole, because the second part of this is I recently read the Elon Musk biography by Walter Isaacson. By the way, the man knows how to write biographies. Kind of weird that you write a biography for someone who's still alive, and it's like, well, I'm missing 5 chapters from this biography. But he said that Elon Musk was known to have said this statement when an employee comes up with an idea. He would say, "This is the stupidest idea I've ever heard." And in the same breath, he said, "So did Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Jeff Bezos." They were known to have said things like that to employees who come up with ideas that, in their opinion, are bad. Um, each one of them has created companies that are valued over $1 trillion. Can we really say that those are bad leaders?
I think we can make a distinction. Those may be very effective leaders when it comes to generating revenue. That doesn't necessarily mean that leadership style is healthy in terms of caring for employees.
Okay. So, we have to go back to Milton Friedman and ask ourselves, what's the purpose of a company? A company obviously relies on having CEOs and leaders and managers and employees. And if the best CEOs are the ones who, pardon my language, suck as leaders, uh, is that something we should worry about?
I think it depends on your perspective. And I think there's also, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. First of all, there's context to those statements too. I would be interested to know what's the context of that, right? What's the tone with which that's being said? Right? Is it being said in an angry, that is the stupidest thing ever? Or is it being said in a, that is the dumbest idea I've ever heard, right? Those have two very different feels on them, right? So I don't think we have enough information to even evaluate the statement. I think there's also, let's understand, how is that impacting the atmosphere of creativity, right? The companies that you mentioned are companies that rely on innovation. And so are we creating, I think there's something about honesty and being able to say, okay, that idea, that dog won't hunt, as we say in Texas, right? To be able to be honest and say, I don't think so. There's something about that, but being able to create an environment where people have the ability to create and innovate over time, I think you're going to see, the impacts of that. And by the way, some of those leaders have made changes recently that are not very popular with their employees. We will see what that ends up doing to the bottom line over time, where people are like, hey, wait a minute, we were all enjoying working remotely, that was working for us and our families. You don't care about us, and if you don't care about us, then we don't care about you, right? And it has that compromised trust, and it may take some time to see the ripple effects of that, but I think it is something that's at least of concern. Even if it doesn't show up immediately, it may over the long haul.
Yeah, actually, when you touched on working from home, you opened a whole new can of worms that I'm now doing the research for a TV show that I'm going to host on that topic. But that's I'm going to put this aside. How do you, April? Hey, I said April without mistake. I'm getting good at this. So, how do you, April, hear about somebody who's being injured? Is it the leader that comes to you that says, I have an employee that I may have injured, or something? Is it the employee that comes to you? Does the company come to you, or the individual? How do they find you? How do you find them?
I think it can happen in a variety of different ways, right? As people learn that, oh, I do this kind of work, and oh, there's somebody who actually talks about these leadership injury things. As that comes to light, people find me, and sometimes it's the person who's been hurt, and so there's an opportunity for us to talk about that and kind of work through that. I have had leaders who have come to me for multiple reasons. Sometimes the leader is actually dealing with a leadership injury. Sometimes that's something from their past, but now they're recognizing, oh, wait a minute, that's impacting how I'm leading my people. Sometimes it is, oh, actually, I had a pastor who said it this way. He said, the sheep bite. And so there are also sometimes things that the employees do that that impact the leader, and so sometimes they'll do that. Or I've also had, kind of like we talked about earlier, leader A was the injuring leader. Leader B may come to me and say, hey, I've got somebody on my team and I can tell there's something holding them back. I don't think it's something that happened here. How do I navigate that? And so I address that in a variety of different ways, right? I do some leadership consulting where we would have that kind of a conversation. And then I'm also educating people through speaking, doing keynotes and workshops and things like that, just to kind of get these things out there so people are educated about what is a leadership injury, what are kind of the signs and symptoms. There's also a critical leadership injury protocol. So there's a 5-step healing process to be able to recover and kind of go from like, wow, okay, this impacted me, to that place of post-traumatic growth. And like, oh, how am I going to turn that actually into a strength moving forward? And then we also talk about, how do I prevent that? What are the shifts that I can make as a leader to protect myself and to protect my people? And the cool part about that is that great leaders, build into their people in such a way, by believing in them, empowering them, et cetera, that it actually creates a buffer. So that if you have leader B is a really good leader, it can heal the injury from leader A. And then even when that person moves on to leader C, leader B's belief in them serves as a buffer that protects them from future leadership injuries.
Let me ask you, is it recoverable when an employee was really hurt bad by a leader? We both agree that this affects not only the trust that they have in this specific leader, but the trust that they have in leaders in general. Can they really recover? Can you help them recover from it?
Yes.
That was a long answer.
Yes.
I'm not ready with the next question.
Yes. Well, and so here's the other thing. I mean, part of it, I look at the history of where this idea of dealing with invisible injuries came out of the work that I did with combat trauma. And I've seen in that arena, working with veterans for more than a decade, I have seen people go through hell on earth and come out of that with some pretty serious invisible injuries. And I've watched people heal and transform and find hope and find a new perspective and find a new lease on life. So seeing that people can do it with that level of severity, I also know and have seen people can do that with the injuries that take place in the workplace. The human spirit is incredibly resilient. And so there is always hope. Doesn't mean it's easy. The process is simple. It's not necessarily easy, but those who are willing to show up and be honest with themselves and do the work get better.
I should have asked that question last, because now I'm going to ask another question, and that was such an optimistic way to finish. But I still have one more question. When a leader injures employees like this, do you think, or in your experience, is it coming from a place of these leaders were injured like that by others, and they just like kids that do what their parents did?
I think that's a really common cause, is they've seen a certain style or they experienced something. There's also an interesting principle. When we hold a judgment against someone from our past who's hurt us, we're holding that subconsciously in our mind, and that's continuing to be in our mind, and we end up reproducing it, and we create around ourselves what's going on inside us. And so hurt people, right? So that's one of the causes, is those past injuries that haven't been healed. And we see the same thing if we're talking about abuse, right? People who abuse have often been abused. Now, that doesn't always mean it happens that way. There are some leaders where those leadership injuries happen by mistake. They're unintentional. they're accidental, right? Now, if you step on my toes, even if it was an accident, it may still hurt, right? If you did that in tennis shoes, I'll probably be able to walk it off. If you did it in steel-toed boots and you were really emphatic, I might have to get that toe checked out, right? So those things can happen accidentally. The other thing that I want to highlight is that there are real leadership injuries, and then there are what I would call perceived leadership injuries, right? So the person was hurt. It did impact them. It changed how they saw themselves. It changed how they saw leadership. It changed how they felt. And yet, if they could go up to the level of the leader and have the perspective and have all of the facts and all of that kind of stuff, they'd be like, wow, they actually didn't do anything wrong. Oh, wow. If I had been in their position, I would have done the same thing, right? And I've had things like that where I was like, man, that was rough. And then as I matured, and I was like, oh, they were totally right. Yeah. And so recognizing that some of them are real, some of them are perceived, and so being able to sort through that. But the cool part is it doesn't matter what the case is or how it occurred. There's a solution, and there's recovery and healing available regardless of the nature of the original injury.
You brought an interesting point, and I don't know if you deal with that or not. I'll ask. How about a reduction in force? Employees, this is one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. First of all, when they realize that their job has been eliminated, but then they think about their boss not telling them anything. And it's not like, especially in public companies, you can't just start telling people we're going to do a reduction in force without first taking the right legal actions and so on. So often confidentiality prevents you as a leader from doing that. But bottom line is, just like you said, the employee gets hurt. The bottom line is that the employee is injured. How do you deal with things like that, and how do you deal with that?
So I think when that happens, it is still possible for people to walk through that as employees, and for the hurt or damage there to be mitigated by the relationship that they had with the leader. And I think the first example that comes to mind, my father was an executive in a Fortune 100 environment and was there for 30 years, right? And there came a situation where he had to let people go. It was a reduction for like that. This is a mathematical equation, and this has to happen. But because of the way that he had treated people throughout his time of leading them, he made that announcement and they gave him a standing ovation. Right? So if there's that kind of trust that's been built, people have, that's part of having faith in those employees to say, hey, they understand sometimes there are these mathematical realities, right? And maybe some of them had issues with the company at large, or maybe they did, or maybe they didn't. But in terms of the specific leader, the face that showed up and delivered that news, there was still trust because of that history. And they didn't put that on him. They actually honored him for the way that he led.
It's funny. I remember back in Texas Instruments, I was in management leadership training. Of course, the terms are blurred and used interchangeably in companies, unfortunately, because those don't mean the same thing. But I remember that they asked the question, what do you do if an employee comes to you and says, I heard a rumor that there is a reduction in force. Now, you know that the rumor is true. How do you answer it? And I remember how I was amazed by how many people said, the two most common answers were, I don't know what you're talking about, which is a lie. And the second one was, I'll tell you, but don't tell anybody that I told you, which is a breach of confidentiality. And to me, it was like, I can't talk about that. And you understand why I can't talk about that. All I can tell you is that I have your back. And I did. I had their back. When I closed my own company, again, I couldn't pre-announce it. This was, more than 20 years ago. I couldn't pre-announce it, But when I did, out of my own pocket, I actually paid the employees to keep getting their salary, not even a discounted salary, until they found a new job, and I helped them find new jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that I think is something that you do. Uh, I'm about to wrap this up, and I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask you how can people get in touch with you. But before I get that, is there anything else that I should have asked you today that I didn't?
I think one of the things is to think about rebuilding your ability to trust when that's happened to you, right? Because it's also part of our empowerment and our sense of agency so that we're not a victim of somebody else's choices, right? And so to have this sense that I'm a powerful person and my okayness, my happiness, and my peace doesn't depend on you as my leader doing all the right things, saying all the right things, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me to have this sense of agency that, hey, you may do something that I don't like, you may do something that even hurts me. And yet I have the power, first of all, to go through that recovery process and say, I can overcome this, I can get better, and I'm not going to never trust again because of you. I'm not going to let you rob me of my ability to trust for the rest of my life. And then recognizing a lot of that rebuilding of trust isn't about you. It's about me saying, okay, were there any red flags that I missed or overlooked? How would I do this differently? Evaluating my ability to trust, and that puts the power back in my hands so that I'm not a victim.
When this is for our audience, when you, April, and I talked about this show ahead of time, when we prepared for it, you kind of made me start thinking about. I keep talking about the trust that one person has in another is the product of the other person's trustworthiness and the first person's trustfulness, and really the only context I used it up until now is that the other person needs to know that no matter how trustworthy they're going to be, they may still not be trusted by some people who suffer from low trustfulness, because we are all the sum of our experiences. But talking to you made me realize that I never started thinking, and maybe you and I should start doing it more together, start thinking about how do we recover trustfulness, which is what you do full time. How do you recover trustfulness? How do you recover my ability to trust people? Well, April, it was great having you here. I think that what you do, first of all, on behalf of our veterans, I thank you for the help that you give them with their facing their PTSD and other trauma that they had as part of their service. I think that what you do is tremendously important for corporations because we have so many examples of bad leadership. And one of the consequences of a bad leadership is that we injure the employees, and not only that we need to think about them as people and not injure them, but we also need to think about the consequences of them being injured and the consequences of them being less trustful. And the consequences are lower creativity, lower productivity, higher attrition, and so on. Before I close, April, what you do is very important. How can people find you?
The easiest way is via the web, and you can go to draprilspeaks.com. If you do that, you don't have to spell Minatrea. And you can also go to leadershipinjury.com and find more specifically about leadership injury there.
So if I charge people $5 to take a poll, to participate in a raffle, and the price is $100 for somebody who spells your last name correctly, am I going to be in a profit or a loss?
Let's find out.
Yeah, that sounded so much better in my head. April, Dr. Minatrea, thank you very much for being a guest on our show today. This will wrap it up. As you heard, the level of trust that we have in other people is the product of their trustworthiness and our trustfulness. There are consequences, severe consequences for bad leadership, for our obsession with leadership. The consequences are often to the employees, but not only to the employees. Employees would lose their trustfulness not only towards the current leader who injured them, but towards leaders in general. But there is a hope at the end, and that's what Dr. April Minatrea does. She helps employees recover from those injuries and build their own trustfulness. April, thank you very much for being with us today again.
It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, like it, subscribe to this channel, and get informed when I release more episodes like that. And remember, the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can you be trusted?